Karoline Leavitt wasn't your typical journalist. She had a knack for sniffing out stories that others would rather keep buried. Her desk was always cluttered with stacks of papers, sticky notes, and half-empty coffee cups, evidence of long nights spent chasing leads. But this time something felt different. This wasn't just another story about city council budgets or minor political scandals. It was bigger, darker, and far more dangerous. It all started on a rainy Tuesday morning, when Karoline received an anonymous tip in her inbox. The email was vague, written in choppy sentences, but one line caught her attention. Judge Boasberg isn't who he claims to be. At first, she thought it might be another conspiracy theory or someone trying to stir trouble. Judge Richard Boasberg was a well-respected figure in Washington, D.C., known for his sharp mind and fair rulings, or so everyone thought. Still, Karoline's instincts told her not to ignore it. Over the years, she'd learned that even the smallest whisper could lead to the loudest truth. Curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to dig deeper. She began by reviewing court records, poring over hundreds of cases handled by Judge Boasberg. On the surface, everything seemed normal. His decisions appeared logical, his reasoning sound. But as Karoline dug into specific cases, patterns began to emerge, patterns that didn't sit right. Certain rulings favored big corporations over ordinary citizens, almost as if they were predetermined. One case involved a small business owner fighting against a massive development project. Despite clear evidence supporting the owner's claim, Boasberg ruled in favor of the corporation. Another case saw a whistleblower's lawsuit dismissed without much explanation, leaving the individual bankrupt and powerless. At first glance, these could have been chalked up to bad luck or unfortunate circumstances. But the more Karoline looked, the more questions arose. Why did so many of these controversial rulings benefit companies tied to lobbyists? And why did some of those same companies seem to share connections with financial groups linked to Judge Boasberg's family? Coincidence? Maybe. But Karoline didn't believe in coincidences, not when there was too much at stake. Her investigation took a turn when she stumbled upon a series of leaked documents. Someone, somewhere, wanted the truth to come out. The files contained emails and memos suggesting that Judge Boasberg had been communicating privately with influential figures outside the courtroom. These weren't casual conversations. They detailed discussions about upcoming cases, strategies to sway outcomes, and even mentions of financial incentives. Karoline's heart raced as she read through them. If these documents were authentic, and her gut told her they were, they painted a picture of corruption that went far beyond anything she'd imagined, but proving it wouldn't be easy. The documents were unsigned, and their origins unclear. Karoline knew she needed someone on the inside, someone who could confirm what she suspected. That's when she heard rumors about a former employee from Boasberg's chambers. This person had left abruptly months earlier, citing personal reasons, but whispers suggested otherwise. Finding this individual wouldn't be simple, though. Whoever they were, they clearly didn't want to be found. Undeterred, Karoline hit the ground running. She visited courthouses, talked to lawyers, and reached out to anyone who might know something. Her persistence paid off when she finally tracked down the ex-employee. They agreed to meet, but only under strict conditions. No names, no photos, no recording devices, just a conversation in a quiet corner of a nondescript cafe on the outskirts of town. When the day came, Karoline arrived early, nerves buzzing. She ordered a cup of black coffee and waited, scanning the room for any sign of her mystery source. Finally, a man walked in, his face partially hidden beneath a hoodie. He glanced around cautiously before sliding into the seat across from her. Without wasting time, he slid a flash drive across the table. "You'll find everything you need here," he said in a low voice. Then, just as quickly as he appeared, he was gone. Back home, Karoline plugged the flash drive into her computer, her fingers trembling with anticipation. What she found inside confirmed her worst fears. There were emails, audio clips, and handwritten notes detailing how Judge Boasberg manipulated cases to serve his own interests. Some files even hinted at illegal transactions involving offshore accounts. It was a treasure trove of evidence, enough to blow the lid off the entire scandal. But Karoline also knew the risks. Going public with this information wouldn't just put her career on the line, it could put her safety in jeopardy. Powerful people didn't take kindly to having their secrets exposed, especially judges with connections reaching deep into the corridors of power. Yet as she sat there staring at the screen, she realized she had no choice. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the countless lives affected by Judge Boasberg's actions, the families torn apart, the businesses ruined, the voices silenced. Someone had to stand up and say, "Enough." And so, with a deep breath and a steely resolve, Karoline began writing. Each word felt like a step closer to justice, each sentence a challenge to the system that allowed such corruption to thrive. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a battle that would shake the foundations of trust in the legal world and change her life forever. Karoline knew the stakes were high, but she also understood that timing was everything. Rushing to publish her findings without careful thought could backfire, leaving her vulnerable to accusations of bias or inaccuracy. She spent days cross-referencing every piece of evidence on the flash drive, comparing it with public records and court documents. Her apartment became a fortress of paper trails, sticky notes plastered on walls, timelines scribbled across whiteboards, and endless cups of coffee fueling late-night sessions. The deeper she delved, the more disturbing the picture became. One document revealed how Judge Boasberg had quietly dismissed a lawsuit filed by a group of factory workers who claimed their employer was violating safety regulations. The company involved wasn't just any business. It was tied to a lobbying firm that had recently hosted a fundraiser attended by Boasberg's family members. Another file showed emails discussing how certain cases were delayed until after key stock market events, benefiting investors with insider knowledge. It wasn't just corruption. It was a calculated game where justice was traded like poker chips. As Karoline pieced together the puzzle, she couldn't shake off the weight of what she was uncovering. These weren't abstract legal maneuvers, they affected real people. She remembered reading about a single mother who lost custody of her child because of a ruling that seemed unusually harsh. At the time, it hadn't raised many eyebrows, but now looking at the context, Karoline saw something else entirely. That same week, Boasberg had presided over a corporate merger case involving a company linked to his financial interests. Was it possible he'd made an example of the mother? To avoid scrutiny, the thought sickened her. But as much as the evidence pointed toward wrongdoing, Karoline faced another challenge: making people care. In today's world, scandals came and went, often drowned out by noise or dismissed as politics as usual. To break through, she needed to tell a story, not just report facts. And so she decided to focus on the human side of the scandal. She reached out to individuals directly impacted by Boasberg's rulings, hoping to give them a voice. Her first call was to a retired teacher living in a small town 2 hours outside the city. The woman had been fighting for years to hold a pharmaceutical company accountable for contaminating her community's water supply. Despite overwhelming scientific evidence supporting her case, Judge Boasberg had thrown it out, citing lack of jurisdiction. When Karoline spoke to her, the pain in her voice was palpable. "We trusted the system," the woman said, her tone heavy with resignation. "Now we don't even let our kids drink from the tap." Karoline listened intently, jotting down notes while trying not to let her emotions overwhelm her. This was why she did what she did, to remind people that behind every headline there were lives being upended. Over the next few days, she spoke to others: a struggling entrepreneur whose startup was crushed by a predatory corporation, a whistleblower ostracized for speaking out against environmental violations, and a grieving father whose wrongful death lawsuit was inexplicably dismissed. Each conversation reinforced her resolve. These stories weren't just anecdotes. They were proof that Boasberg's actions had consequences far beyond the courtroom. With her research complete, Karoline turned her attention to crafting the article. She wanted it to hit hard but remain fair. Every sentence had to be backed by evidence, every claim verifiable. She started with the most damning revelation: a series of emails showing Boasberg coordinating with lobbyists to influence outcomes in major cases. From there, she wove in the personal stories she'd collected, painting a vivid picture of how these decisions rippled through communities. The final section laid out the broader implications. If a judge could act with such impunity, what did that say about the integrity of the entire system? When the article finally went live, Karoline braced herself for the fallout. She posted it on her publication's website late at night, knowing it would take time for the story to gain traction. By morning, however, the response was overwhelming. Social media lit up with reactions ranging from outrage to disbelief. Some praised her bravery, calling her a modern-day hero. Others accused her of sensationalism, questioning her motives and the authenticity of her sources. Even Judge Boasberg himself issued a statement, labeling the allegations baseless attacks and vowing to clear his name. What surprised Karoline most, though, was the flood of messages from ordinary people. Many shared their own experiences of feeling betrayed by the justice system. A veteran wrote about losing his disability benefits due to a questionable ruling. A young woman described how her sexual harassment case was dismissed despite strong evidence. Reading these accounts, Karoline realized she'd tapped into something bigger than herself, a growing frustration with a system that seemed rigged against the average person. Meanwhile, the backlash began. Anonymous callers left threatening voicemails, warning her to back off or face consequences. Her editor received pressure from influential figures urging him to retract the article. But Karoline stood firm, reminding herself why she'd started this journey in the first place. If anything, the resistance only strengthened her conviction. She wasn't fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who'd ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. Within days, the story caught the attention of federal investigators. Initially skeptical, they soon found themselves unable to ignore the mounting evidence. Subpoenas were issued, documents seized, and witnesses interviewed. As the investigation unfolded, cracks began to show in Boasberg's carefully constructed facade. Former colleagues came forward with their own suspicions, recounting moments when his behavior seemed off. Lawyers recounted odd exchanges during trials, and clerks admitted to feeling uneasy about certain rulings. For Karoline, watching the dominoes fall was both satisfying and surreal. She'd spent months buried in paperwork, chasing leads and risking her reputation, all for this moment. Yet, as the headlines multiplied and the scandal-dominated news cycles, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. How many lives had been destroyed before anyone noticed? How many more judges might be operating under similar shadows? Still, there was hope. The public outcry sparked conversations about reform, with activists calling for greater transparency and accountability. In the judiciary, lawmakers introduced bills aimed at closing loopholes that allowed such abuses to occur. People were waking up demanding change, and Karoline knew her work had played a role in that awakening, but the battle wasn't over yet. Judge Boasberg still clung to his position, denying all wrongdoing and launching a PR campaign to salvage his image. Meanwhile, whispers circulated about potential retaliation against Karoline. Friends advised her to lay low, but she refused. If anything, she doubled down, continuing to report on developments and amplify the voices of those affected. In the end, Karoline understood that exposing the truth wasn't a one-time event. It was an ongoing fight. And while she didn't know what the future held, one thing was certain: she'd ignited a fire that wouldn't burn out anytime soon. The days following the publication of Karoline's exposé were a whirlwind. Her phone buzzed nonstop with calls, texts, and notifications. Some messages were supportive, people thanking her for shining a light on something they'd long suspected but couldn't prove. Others were hostile, filled with threats or accusations that she was ruining lives without solid proof. Karoline tried to focus on the positives, but it wasn't easy. The constant barrage of attention made it hard to think clearly, let alone continue her work. One morning, as she scrolled through her inbox, she noticed an email from someone claiming to be a former colleague of Judge Boasberg. The subject line read, "You need to hear this." Skeptical but intrigued, Karoline opened it. The sender didn't reveal much in the message itself, only saying they had information that could take this story even further and asking, to meet in person later that evening. There was no name attached, just a location, a quiet park bench near the National Mall. Karoline hesitated. After everything she'd been through, meeting strangers in secluded spots felt risky, but she also knew how important it was to follow every lead, especially now when the stakes were so high. So armed with her notebook and a dose of caution, she headed to the park after sunset. The air was cool, and the streets were quieter than usual. As she approached the designated bench, she spotted a figure sitting alone, hood pulled up to shield their face. "Are you the one who emailed me?" Karoline asked, keeping her distance. The person nodded slowly, glancing around before gesturing for her to sit. "I don't have much time," they said in a hushed tone. "But if you want to understand what's really going on, you need to hear this." Over the next 20 minutes, the stranger laid out details that sent chills down Karoline's spine. They claimed Judge Boasberg wasn't acting alone, that he was part of a larger network of officials using their positions to enrich themselves and protect powerful allies. According to the source, these individuals coordinated behind closed doors, sharing strategies to manipulate cases and avoid scrutiny. It wasn't just about money. It was about maintaining control over entire industries, silencing dissent and ensuring loyalty within their ranks. What shocked Karoline most, though, was the mention of a secret ledger. Allegedly kept hidden in a secure location, it contained records of bribes, payouts, and agreements between judges, lobbyists, and corporate executives. If true, this ledger would be the smoking gun, the ultimate proof of systemic corruption. "This changes everything," Karoline whispered, scribbling notes furiously. "Do you know where it is?" The source shook their head. "No one knows for sure. But I've heard whispers. It's somewhere safe, accessible only to a select few. If you can find it, you'll have all the evidence you need." Before Karoline could ask more questions, the stranger stood up abruptly. "That's all I can tell you. Be careful, they're watching." And with that, they disappeared into the shadows, leaving Karoline alone with her thoughts. Back at her apartment, Karoline couldn't shake the feeling that she was onto something monumental. The idea of a secret ledger sounded almost too dramatic, like something out of a movie. But given everything else she'd uncovered, it didn't seem far-fetched. She spent hours brainstorming ways to track it down, considering every angle. Could it be stored digitally, hidden in a physical location, guarded by someone loyal to Boasberg? Her first move was to revisit the flash drive she'd received earlier. Maybe there was a clue buried in those files that she'd missed. She went through them again, this time paying closer attention to any mention of storage facilities, safes, or secure communications. Sure enough, tucked away in a folder labeled Miscellaneous, she found a document referencing a property owned by a shell company linked to Boasberg's family. It was a warehouse on the outskirts of town, an odd investment for a judge, to say the least. Excited but cautious, Karoline decided to investigate further. She enlisted the help of a trusted friend who worked in real estate research. Together, they dug into public records, uncovering details about the warehouse's ownership and usage history. On paper, it appeared to be abandoned, unused for years, but satellite images told a different story. Recent photos showed signs of activity, vehicles coming and going, lights on late at night. Something was happening there, and Karoline intended to find out what. Late one night, she drove to the warehouse, parking a block away to avoid drawing attention. Clutching a flashlight and her camera, she approached cautiously, sticking to the shadows. The building was surrounded by a tall fence topped with barbed wire, but a side gate stood slightly ajar. Taking a deep breath, she slipped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The interior was dimly lit, with rows of dusty shelves and crates scattered around. At first glance, it seemed empty, just another forgotten space. But as Karoline moved deeper, she noticed something unusual. A locked door at the far end of the room. Unlike the rest of the warehouse, this area looked well-maintained, almost pristine. Someone had taken care to keep it hidden. She tried the handle, unsurprised to find it secured. Peering through a crack in the frame, she caught a glimpse of filing cabinets and a desk stacked with papers. This had to be it, the place where the ledger might be kept. But getting inside wouldn't be easy. Reluctantly, she snapped a few photos and left, knowing she'd need reinforcements to proceed safely. Over the next few days, Karoline worked tirelessly to gather more intel. She reached out to cybersecurity experts, hoping to identify digital backups of the ledger if they existed. She also contacted independent investigators willing to assist without asking too many questions. Every step brought her closer to unraveling the mystery, but it also increased the danger. She started noticing unfamiliar cars parked outside her apartment, strange clicks on her phone line, and shadowy figures lingering nearby. Whoever was behind this operation clearly didn't appreciate her snooping. Despite the risks, Karoline refused to back down. She reminded herself of the people counting on her, the factory workers, the whistleblowers, the single mothers whose lives had been shattered by injustice. Their voices echoed in her mind, fueling her determination to see this through. Whatever lay behind that locked door, she vowed to uncover it, not just for herself, but for everyone who deserved answers. As she prepared for her next move, Karoline realized she was no longer just a journalist chasing a story. She had become a catalyst for change, standing at the center of a storm that threatened to upend an entire system. And while the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. She wasn't going to stop until the truth came to light. Karoline knew she couldn't handle this alone. Breaking into the warehouse or trying to force her way into that locked room was out of the question. It would be reckless, dangerous, and likely illegal. Instead, she needed a plan, one that involved people she could trust. Her first call was to an old friend who worked in private investigations. He wasn't thrilled about getting involved, but agreed to meet her for coffee after hearing her out. "You're playing with fire here," he warned, as they sat in a quiet corner of a bustling cafe. "These aren't small-time crooks we're talking about. If you're right about this ledger, then whoever's protecting it has serious resources, and they won't hesitate to use them." "I know," Karoline said, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "But if I don't do something, who will? This isn't just about me or Judge Boasberg anymore, it's about holding people accountable. If we let this slide, what does that say about us?" Her friend sighed, rubbing his temples. "All right, here's what I'll do. I can help you get eyes on the place without raising suspicion, but you need to promise me one thing: no heroics. If things get dicey, you walk away. Got it?" Karoline nodded, though deep down she wasn't sure she'd stick to that promise. Still, having backup gave her a sliver of confidence. Over the next few days, her friend arranged for discreet surveillance of the warehouse. Using cameras mounted on nearby buildings and drones flying at high altitudes, they mapped out patterns of activity. They discovered that deliveries were made twice a week, always late at night, and that security patrols followed a predictable route. Armed with this information, Karoline began piecing together a strategy. She realized that timing was everything. If they acted during one of the delivery nights when guards were distracted, they might have a chance to slip inside unnoticed. The challenge was figuring out how to bypass the locked door once they were. In her next move took her to a tech-savvy acquaintance who specialized in cybersecurity. While not a hacker by trade, this person had experience dealing with encrypted systems and digital locks. When Karoline explained the situation, their eyes widened in disbelief. "This is insane," they muttered, shaking their head. "You're lucky I owe you a favor, otherwise I'd tell you to forget it." "Just hear me out," Karoline pleaded. "If there's any kind of electronic system securing that door, I need your help to disable it temporarily. No hacking, no breaking laws, just finding a loophole." After some reluctance, the tech expert agreed to assist. Together, they devised a plan to create a harmless electromagnetic pulse, EMP device capable of briefly disrupting electronic locks. It wouldn't leave a trace, and it wouldn't harm anyone. It was just enough to give them access to the room. Karoline felt a flicker of hope for the first time in days. The night of the operation arrived sooner than expected. Dressed in dark clothes and carrying minimal gear, Karoline and her team gathered a block away from the warehouse. Her heart raced as she reviewed the plan one last time. The goal was simple: get in, retrieve whatever evidence was inside, and get out before anyone noticed. Easier said than done. As midnight approached, the streets grew eerily quiet. A delivery truck pulled up to the warehouse, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Guards emerged to unload crates, their attention focused entirely on the task at hand. This was their window. Karoline signaled to her team and they moved quickly, sticking to the shadows. Reaching the side gate, they slipped inside, careful to avoid making noise. Inside, the air smelled of dust and rust, the faint hum of fluorescent lights echoing overhead. They reached the locked door without incident, and the tech expert got to work. Within minutes, the EMP device did its job. With a soft click, the lock disengaged and the door creaked open. Karoline stepped inside, her flashlight illuminating rows of filing cabinets and stacks of documents. Her pulse quickened as she began rifling through the papers, searching for anything resembling the mysterious ledger. It didn't take long to find it. Tucked away in a drawer marked "Confidential" was a thick binder filled with handwritten entries, dates, and amounts. Each page detailed transactions between judges, lobbyists, and corporate executives, bribes, payouts, and agreements laid bare for anyone to see. Karoline's hands trembled as she flipped through it, realizing the magnitude of what she held in her hands. This wasn't just proof of Judge Boasberg's corruption, it was evidence of a vast conspiracy spanning years. "We've got it," she whispered, signaling to her team. "Let's go." Exiting the warehouse proved trickier than entering. As they retraced their steps, one of the guards suddenly turned toward their direction, his flashlight sweeping across the space. Karoline froze, pressing herself against a shelf, praying he wouldn't spot them. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, mercifully, the guard shrugged and walked away, muttering something under his breath. Breathing a sigh of relief, the group made it back to their car without further incident. Once safely away from the warehouse, Karoline allowed herself a brief moment of triumph. They'd done it. They'd uncovered the truth. But she also knew this was only the beginning. Back at her apartment, Karoline spent hours poring over the ledger, cross-referencing its contents with her existing evidence. Every entry confirmed her worst suspicions. Judge Boasberg was deeply entangled in a web of corruption that reached far beyond him. What shocked her most, however, was the sheer scale of it. Dozens of cases had been manipulated, countless lives ruined, all for profit and power. Realizing the implications, Karoline faced a dilemma. Publishing the ledger outright would expose the conspiracy, but it could also put her and her sources in grave danger. Whoever was behind this operation wouldn't hesitate to retaliate, yet keeping the information hidden felt like a betrayal of everything she stood for. In the end, she decided on a middle ground. She contacted a trusted colleague at a major news outlet, sharing portions of the ledger along with instructions to release it incrementally. By spreading out the revelations, they could control the narrative while minimizing blowback. More importantly, it gave authorities time to act. Within hours of the first report going live, the story exploded. Headlines blared accusations of widespread corruption, naming not only Judge Boasberg but also several other high-profile figures implicated in the scandal. Public outrage reached a fever pitch, with protests erupting outside courthouses and government buildings. Calls for accountability echoed across social media, demanding justice for those affected. For Karoline, the aftermath was both exhilarating and exhausting. She became a household name overnight, hailed by some as a champion of transparency and vilified by others as a troublemaker. Anonymous threats poured in, forcing her to change her daily routine and rely on friends for support. Through it all, she remained steadfast, knowing she'd done the right thing. What surprised her most, though, was the impact on ordinary people. Strangers reached out to share their gratitude, recounting how her reporting had given them hope in a system they'd long considered broken. Lawyers and activists joined forces, pushing for reforms to prevent such abuses in the future. Even lawmakers began drafting legislation aimed at increasing oversight and accountability within the judiciary. As the dust settled, Karoline reflected on everything she'd been through. She'd started this journey seeking answers, driven by a desire to uncover the truth. Along the way, she'd risked her safety, tested her limits, and confronted the darkest corners of human nature. But she'd also witnessed resilience, courage, and the power of collective action. Though the fight was far from over, one thing was clear: the world was paying attention. And as long as people like Karoline refused to look away, there was still hope for change. The fallout from the Ledger's release was swift and chaotic. It wasn't just Judge Boasberg anymore. The scandal had grown into a sprawling web that implicated some of the most powerful figures in Washington, D.C. Names that once commanded respect were now splashed across headlines tied to accusations of bribery, coercion, and abuse of power. For Karoline, watching the story unfold felt surreal. She'd spent months chasing shadows, piecing together fragments of evidence and risking everything to expose the truth. Now it seemed like the world couldn't stop talking about it, but fame came with complications. Karoline's phone buzzed, constantly, not just with messages of support but also with venomous attacks. Some accused her of ruining careers without solid proof, while others dismissed her as a pawn in a larger political game. Anonymous comments online called her reckless, dangerous, or worse. One night she found graffiti sprayed on the wall outside her apartment building. "Stop digging." The message was clear. She was treading on dangerous ground, and someone wanted her to back off. Still, Karoline refused to let fear dictate her actions. Every time doubt crept in, she reminded herself of the people counting on her: the factory, workers, whistleblowers, and families whose lives had been shattered by the decisions made behind closed doors. Their faces haunted her dreams, urging her to keep going no matter what. So, despite the threats and hostility, she pressed forward, determined to see justice served. Meanwhile, federal investigators worked tirelessly to unravel the conspiracy. Subpoenas flew left and right, demanding documents, emails, and testimony from those named in the ledger. Lawyers scrambled to defend their clients, spinning narratives of misunderstandings and exaggerations. But the sheer volume of evidence made denial nearly impossible. One by one, key players began cooperating, hoping for leniency in exchange for information. Each confession added another layer to the scandal, revealing how deeply entrenched corruption had become within the system. As details emerged, public outrage reached new heights. Protesters gathered outside courthouses holding signs that read, "Justice for all" and "No more secrets." Social media lit up with hashtags calling for accountability, drawing attention from activists around the country. Even late-night talk show hosts weighed in, using humor to highlight the absurdity of judges accepting bribes while claiming to uphold the law. For many, the scandal struck a nerve because it exposed something they'd long suspected but struggled to prove. The system wasn't fair. Ordinary citizens saw their struggles reflected in the stories uncovered by Karoline's reporting. A single mother who'd lost custody of her children due to an unjust ruling shared her experience on live television, tears streaming down her face as she described feeling powerless against a rigged system. An elderly man recounted how his retirement savings vanished after investing in a company cleared of wrongdoing thanks to Judge Boasberg's intervention. These personal accounts resonated deeply, transforming abstract legal jargon into real-life pain and suffering. Amidst the chaos, Judge Boasberg tried desperately to salvage his reputation. He appeared on news programs insisting he was innocent and blaming rogue employees for any misconduct. His lawyers argued that the ledger was unreliable, suggesting it might have been fabricated or tampered with. Yet his denials rang hollow. With each passing day, more evidence surfaced linking him directly to the corrupt activities outlined in the document. The walls were closing in, and there was nowhere left to hide. Karoline watched all this unfold with mixed emotions. On one hand, she felt vindicated. Her instincts had been right, and the truth was finally coming to light. On the other hand, she couldn't shake the sadness of knowing how much damage had already been done. Lives had been ruined, trust shattered, and faith in institutions eroded. No amount of exposure could undo that harm. To make matters worse, the backlash against her grew fiercer. Someone slashed her car tires overnight, her email inbox filled with hateful messages, some threatening violence if she didn't retract her claims. Even her editor received calls pressuring him to silence. Her friends urged her to lay low, warning her that powerful people didn't take kindly to being exposed. But instead of retreating, Karoline doubled down. She gave interviews, wrote follow-up articles, and amplified the voices of those affected by the scandal. If anything, the resistance only strengthened her resolve. One evening, as she sat at her cluttered desk reviewing notes, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Hesitant but curious, she answered. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "Listen carefully," the caller said. "You've done enough damage. Stop digging or you'll regret it." Karoline's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay composed. "I'm just doing my job," she replied evenly. "If you think threatening me will change that, you're wrong." The line went dead. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down, adrenaline coursing through her veins. For a moment, fear gripped her. But then anger took over. Who did these people think they were? Did they honestly believe intimidation would silence her? She grabbed her notebook and started writing furiously, channeling her frustration into words. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about standing up for everyone who'd ever been silenced, ignored, or pushed aside. Over the next few weeks, Karoline focused on amplifying the human side of the scandal. She traveled to small towns and cities, meeting individuals whose lives had intersected with Judge Boasberg's rulings. In one community, she met a group of farmers fighting to save their land from a corporate takeover aided by a favorable court decision. In another, she spoke with a young woman whose sexual harassment case had been dismissed despite overwhelming evidence. Each story added depth to the narrative, reminding readers that behind every headline were real people struggling to survive. Her efforts paid off. The more she highlighted their experiences, the harder it became for critics to dismiss her work as sensationalism. People connected with the humanity of her reporting, recognizing themselves in the struggles she described. Support poured in from unexpected places, lawyers offering pro bono services, activists organizing rallies, and even lawmakers proposing sweeping reforms to prevent similar scandals in the future. Yet, as momentum built, so did the stakes. Federal prosecutors announced plans to bring criminal charges against Judge Boasberg and several others implicated in the scandal. Grand jury hearings loomed on the horizon, promising dramatic confrontations and explosive revelations. For Karoline, this marked both a victory and a turning point. The initial battle had been won, the truth was out, but the war for accountability was far from over. Late one night, as she reviewed her notes for what felt like the 100th time, Karoline paused to reflect. She thought about the risks she'd taken, the sacrifices she'd made, and the countless hours spent chasing leads. It hadn't been easy, in fact, it had been downright terrifying at times. But looking back, she realized something important. She wasn't alone. Thousands of people had rallied behind her cause, refusing to let the powerful escape scrutiny. Together, they'd sparked a movement, a demand for transparency, fairness, and justice. As dawn broke over the city skyline, Karoline smiled faintly. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure. The fight wasn't hers alone anymore. It belonged to everyone who believed in the possibility of change. And as long as people refused to look away, the truth would always find a way to shine through the darkness. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Judge Boasberg finally faced his accusers. Cameras lined the hallways outside, reporters jostling for position to catch a glimpse of the man whose name had become synonymous with scandal. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy. Lawyers whispered urgently, court staff avoided eye contact, and the air felt thick with anticipation. For Karoline, sitting in the back row with her notebook open, it was surreal to see the story she'd fought so hard to uncover play out in real life. Boasberg looked different from the confident figure Karoline had studied during her investigation. Gone was the sharp suit and commanding presence. Instead, he appeared haggard, his face pale and drawn. His lawyers surrounded him like a protective shield, their expressions grim as prosecutors outlined the charges against him. Bribery, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, the list went on, each accusation painting a clearer picture of systemic corruption. As the proceedings began, Karoline leaned forward, pen poised over paper. Witnesses took the stand one by one, recounting their roles in the scandal. A former lobbyist admitted to funneling money into offshore accounts linked to Boasberg's family. A corporate executive described late-night meetings where judges were promised lucrative deals in exchange for favorable rulings. Each testimony added another brick to the wall of evidence closing in around Boasberg. But it wasn't just the high-profile testimonies that captured Karoline's attention. It was the quieter moments, the pauses, the glances exchanged between defendants and their lawyers that revealed the cracks beneath the surface. At one point, a clerk who'd worked under Boasberg broke down in tears while describing how she'd been pressured to alter documents. "I didn't want to do it," she sobbed, her voice trembling. "But I was scared. Everyone knew what happened if you said no." Karoline scribbled furiously, capturing every word. These stories mattered, not because they made headlines, but because they showed the human cost of corruption. People weren't just numbers or pawns in a game. They were individuals caught in a system designed to crush dissent. The clerk's testimony resonated deeply with Karoline, reminding her why she'd started this journey in the first place. Outside the courthouse, public sentiment continued to boil over. Protests erupted daily, drawing crowds of all ages and backgrounds. Some carried signs reading, "Justice delayed is justice denied," while others chanted slogans demanding accountability. Karoline attended several rallies, listening to speeches from activists and ordinary citizens alike. One woman stood on a makeshift stage, holding up a photo of her son, a young man who died after losing access to health care due to a court ruling influenced by Boasberg's decisions. "They took my boy away," she said, her voice breaking. "And for what? So a few rich people could get richer? That's not justice, that's theft. And we won't rest until they pay for what they've done." Her words echoed through the crowd, met with cheers and applause. For Karoline, it was a powerful reminder of the ripple effects of corruption. Every ruling, every decision had consequences that rippled outward, affecting lives in ways most people never considered. Back in the courtroom, the drama intensified as prosecutors introduced new pieces of evidence. Among them was a series of encrypted emails retrieved from servers tied to Boasberg's network. Decoded transcripts revealed conversations about manipulating cases, silencing whistleblowers, and even discussing potential threats to journalists investigating the scandal. When Karoline heard her own name mentioned in one email, her stomach churned. She hadn't realized just how close she'd come to becoming a target herself. Despite mounting evidence, Boasberg's defense team fought fiercely, attempting to discredit witnesses and challenge the authenticity of documents. They argued that the ledger was circumstantial at best, claiming it lacked direct ties to their client. But federal investigators countered with forensic experts who testified to its legitimacy, pointing out fingerprints and handwriting matches linking Boasberg to key entries. For Karoline, watching the legal battle unfold was both exhilarating and exhausting. Every day brought new twists and revelations, keeping the public glued to updates. Yet the emotional toll weighed heavily on her. Sleepless nights became routine, her mind racing with thoughts of what might happen next. Would Boasberg walk free, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions? Or would justice prevail, setting a precedent for accountability? Amidst the chaos, Karoline found solace in unexpected places. Strangers approached her after hearings, thanking her for her courage and determination. Some shared their own experiences of battling injustice, while others simply offered words of encouragement. One elderly man handed her a small envelope, containing a handwritten note. "Keep fighting. We're counting on you." It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything to Karoline. She also drew strength from the growing movement sparked by her reporting. Activists launched campaigns calling for judicial reform, pushing for measures like term limits, stricter ethics rules, and increased transparency in court proceedings. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at addressing loopholes exploited by corrupt officials. Even within the legal community, voices began speaking out, urging colleagues to take responsibility for restoring trust in the system. Yet despite the progress, challenges remained. Threats against Karoline escalated, forcing her to rely on security escorts and change her daily routines. Anonymous callers left chilling messages, warning her to drop the case or face consequences. One night, someone threw a brick through her apartment window, narrowly missing her as she sat working at her desk. Shaken but undeterred, Karoline installed cameras and reinforced locks, refusing to let fear dictate her actions. Her editor suggested she step back temporarily, citing concerns for her safety, but Karoline shook her head firmly. "If I stop now, it sends a message that they can scare us into silence," she said. "That's exactly what they want. I'm not giving them that satisfaction." As weeks turned into months, the trial dragged on, testing everyone's patience. Legal arguments stretched into hours, cross-examinations grew heated, and tempers flared. Through it all, Karoline remained a constant presence, documenting every detail and sharing updates with the public. Her articles provided clarity amid confusion, helping readers understand the significance of each development. Finally, after months of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the foreperson stood to deliver the decision. Karoline held her breath, her pen hovering above her notebook. When the words came, "Guilty on all counts," a collective gasp swept through the room. Boasberg slumped, in his seat, his face pale as murmurs of disbelief rippled through the gallery. For Karoline, the moment was bittersweet. On one hand, it was a victory, a rare instance of accountability in a world often devoid of it. On the other hand, it underscored just how broken the system truly was. How many more Boasbergs were out there, hiding in plain sight? How many lives had already been destroyed before anyone noticed? As reporters rushed to file their stories, Karoline lingered in the courtroom, taking in the scene. Families hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces. Activists cheered quietly, knowing this was only the beginning of a larger fight. And somewhere in the midst of it all, Karoline felt a flicker of hope. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but this verdict proved that it was possible, if enough people refused to look away. Walking out into the sunlight, she paused for a moment, letting the warmth wash over her. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure: the truth had power. And as long as there were people willing to fight for it, justice still had a chance. The guilty verdict against Judge Boasberg marked a turning point, but for Karoline, it wasn't the end of the road. It was just the beginning of a much bigger fight. The trial had exposed cracks in the system that ran far deeper than one corrupting judge. It revealed how greed and power could poison institutions meant to protect ordinary people, and while the world celebrated this rare win for justice, Karoline knew the real work was only starting. In the weeks following the verdict, the fallout rippled through Washington, D.C. like an earthquake. High-profile figures implicated in the scandal scrambled to distance themselves from Boasberg, issuing public apologies or resigning quietly. Some tried to downplay their involvement, claiming they'd been misled or unaware of the extent of the corruption. But the public wasn't buying it anymore. Trust in authority had been shattered, and people demanded answers and action. Karoline threw herself into reporting on the aftermath, determined to keep the momentum going. She wrote about the families still fighting to rebuild their lives after years of injustice. She highlighted grassroots movements pushing for reform, amplifying voices calling for change. Her articles became rallying cries, inspiring others to join the cause. Lawyers offered free consultations to victims of unfair rulings. Activists organized petitions demanding stricter oversight of judges and lawmakers. Even artists contributed, creating murals and songs dedicated to the idea of accountability. But not everyone appreciated her persistence. Powerful enemies continued to push back, trying to discredit her work and undermine the movement she'd helped spark. Anonymous trolls flooded social media with attacks, accusing her of exaggerating the scandal for personal gain. A few politicians dismissed her reporting as sensationalism, arguing that focusing on individual cases distracted from larger issues. Yet instead of discouraging her, these criticisms fueled her determination. Every attempt to silence her only reminded her why transparency mattered so much. One evening, as she sat at her cluttered desk reviewing notes for yet another article, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Hesitant but curious, she answered. On the other end was a soft-spoken man who introduced himself as a retired investigator. He explained that he'd followed her reporting closely and wanted to share something important, information about similar networks operating in other cities across the country. What you uncovered here is just the tip of the iceberg, he said cautiously. This kind of corruption isn't unique to DC. It's happening everywhere, often hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and legal jargon. If you're willing to dig deeper, I can help connect you with sources. Karoline felt a mix of excitement and dread. The thought of expanding her investigation nationwide was daunting, especially after everything she'd already endured. But she also knew she couldn't ignore the possibility that this problem stretched beyond one courtroom. After thanking him, she ended the call and stared at her computer screen, weighing her options. Deep down, though, she already knew what she had to do. Over the next few months, Karoline traveled extensively, meeting whistleblowers, activists, and victims in cities large and small. Each stop revealed new stories of systemic abuse, judges accepting bribes, corporations exploiting loopholes, and everyday citizens paying the price. In Chicago, she met a factory worker whose lawsuit against unsafe working conditions had been mysteriously dismissed despite overwhelming evidence. In Atlanta, she spoke with a teacher battling a predatory lender whose practices were protected by favorable court rulings. Everywhere she went, she saw the same pattern: those with power bending the rules to serve themselves, leaving the rest to suffer. Her expanded investigation reignited public outrage, drawing attention to issues many had long ignored. Lawmakers began proposing sweeping reforms aimed at increasing transparency and holding officials accountable. Judges' financial disclosures came under scrutiny, leading to calls for stricter regulations. Even within the legal community, conversation shifted toward rebuilding trust, a recognition that without credibility, the entire system risked collapse. Through it all, Karoline remained a central figure in the movement. Her courage inspired countless others to speak up, refusing to let fear dictate their actions. People reached out to thank her, not just for exposing wrongdoing, but for reminding them that change was possible when enough voices joined together. One message stood out among the hundreds she received. You've shown us that no matter how dark things seem, there's always hope if we refuse to stay silent. Despite the progress, challenges persisted. Threats against Karoline escalated, forcing her to rely on security escorts and constantly change her routines. Late-night calls and ominous messages became routine, testing her resolve. Friends urged her to step back, warning her that some fights came at too high a cost. But Karoline refused to give in. Every time doubt crept in, she thought about the faces she'd seen during her travels. The factory workers, teachers, and families counting on her to keep shining a light where darkness thrived. By the end of the year, the impact of her work was undeniable. Reforms passed in multiple states aimed at preventing similar scandals in the future. Courts implemented measures to increase accountability, including independent oversight boards and mandatory ethics training for judges. Activists credited Karoline with sparking a national conversation about integrity and justice, transforming frustration into action. For Karoline, the journey changed her in ways she never expected. She'd started as a journalist chasing a story, driven by curiosity and a desire for truth. Along the way, she discovered something deeper, a sense of purpose rooted in standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. Though the scars of the past year would linger, sleepless nights, constant vigilance, moments of doubt, she emerged stronger, more resolute. On a quiet morning, sitting at her desk with coffee steaming beside her, Karoline reflected on everything she'd been through. The ledger, the threats, the protests, all of it had led her here to a moment where hope felt tangible. Justice hadn't been served perfectly and the fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, people were paying attention. They were asking questions, demanding answers, and refusing to settle for less than fairness. As sunlight streamed through her window, Karoline opened a blank document on her laptop and began typing. This time, she wasn't writing about scandals or corruption. Instead, she focused on resilience, the strength of ordinary people coming together to demand better. Because ultimately, that's what this story was about. Not one person's quest for truth, but a collective refusal to accept injustice. And as she wrote, she smiled faintly, knowing that no matter what lay ahead, the truth would always find its way into the light, as long as someone was brave enough to carry the torch.